I never thought the day would come when joy and humiliation could collide so sharply in the same moment. My daughter's wedding was supposed to be the kind of day a father dreams of: white chairs lined up under an April sky, music floating through the air, friends and family gathered to witness love. I had raised Emily alone after her mother passed, and every step she had taken toward this day felt like a victory, a testament to the years I had spent holding our little world together with grit and stubborn love. I should have been proud. I should have been smiling from the first moment to the last, but instead I found myself sprawled on the polished marble floor, the sound of laughter stinging worse than the pain in my shoulder. It happened so fast that at first my mind refused to process it. One second I was reaching for the chair they had set for me at the reception table, moving carefully because my knees don't bend as easily as they used to. The next, it was gone, yanked backward. My body hit the floor with a crack that echoed beneath the chandeliers, silencing the string quartet in mid-note. For a moment, time froze. I could hear my own breath rattling in my chest, my heart slamming against my ribs, the sharp ring of impact rushing through my bones. Then the laughter came, at first hesitant chuckles, then sharper, crueler bursts. Some guests covered their mouths, but others, God help me, laughed freely, as if it was the best joke they had ever seen. And over it all came his voice. Ryan Hale, my daughter's groom, the man who had promised to cherish her, who had sworn to protect her. His words were soft but precise, carried just enough to reach my ears and the ears of those around him. Your place is on the floor. I will never forget the sting of those words. They cut deeper than bone. They weren't just an insult to me. They were a declaration spoken on the day that should have been sacred, aimed to reduce me to nothing in front of my daughter and everyone who mattered to her. I didn't shout. I didn't curse. I didn't give him the satisfaction of seeing me lash out. Instead, I looked up from the marble floor, pain radiating through every joint, and met his eyes. Behind his smug smile, I saw not a man, but a boy playing with power he hadn't earned. Humiliation pressed heavy on my chest, but so did restraint. It was the kind of restraint a man learns after life has tried to break him more times than he can count. I thought of the nights I had stayed awake when Emily was a little girl, working late shifts in the garage, grease under my nails, and exhaustion in my bones just to keep the lights on. I thought of the mornings she sat beside me at the kitchen table, legs swinging from a chair too tall, asking why her mother wasn't there anymore, and me doing everything I could to answer with strength instead of tears. I thought of how I had carried her through grief, through scraped knees and broken hearts, through every storm life hurled at us. All of that, all of me dismissed with one cruel gesture and one crueler sentence. As I braced a hand against the floor to push myself up, I felt the eyes of the room on me. Some were ashamed, some were curious, and some, God help them, were entertained. I saw Emily across the hall, my daughter, my little girl, now in a wedding gown. Her hand had flown to her mouth, her bouquet tilted until roses spilled petals across the aisle. Her face was pale, her lips parted, but no words came. In her eyes, I saw war. War between love and shame, between the dream she had built and the crack that had just run through it. She had dreamed of this day her whole life. Now her future husband had made her father a spectacle. I rose slowly, deliberately, the way a man stands when the world thinks it has beaten him, but he refuses to stay down. The laughter died in throats that remembered they had hearts. Guests shifted eyes darting away, ashamed not of me, but of themselves for laughing when cruelty disguised itself as humor. I didn't look at Ryan. I didn't give him more than the weight of my silence. Instead, I looked at Emily, steady, calm. She needed to see something stronger than anger. She needed to see the man who had raised her, who had never let the world crush her spirit, standing tall even when knocked flat. I dragged the chair upright myself, the scrape of wood against marble, loud in the hollow silence. Then I sat. My shoulder burned from the fall, but the fire under my skin was hotter. I clasped my hands together, grounding myself. Around me, the officiant cleared his throat and tried to pull the ceremony back on track, words stumbling from his lips. The music stuttered to life again, but no one's heart was in it. People pretended. They smiled, they clapped, they lifted glasses, but everything had shifted. And then came the boots. Not polished shoes gliding across marble. Boots. Heavy. Steady. The kind that carry a man across ground he'd rather forget. I heard them before I saw him. Guests turned their whispers, prickling the air. At the entrance stood a man in his 60s, silver at his temples, shoulders squared, like he had never left the service. His suit was tailored, but his bearing gave him away. He was late, and when his eyes swept the room and landed on me, he stopped cold. His color drained, his lips parted, and then just above a whisper but strong enough to split the moment open, he said, "Sergeant Carter." "Is that you?" The words hung in the air like thunder. Gasps rippled through the room. The string quartet faltered again, bows hovering midair. Emily's eyes snapped to him, then back to me, confusion written across her face. She didn't know. She couldn't know. That recognition was a ghost from a life I had buried in dust and photographs. I didn't answer. Not yet. Some truths need silence to give them weight. But in that silence, everything changed. When the music picked back up, when the officiant stammered through his script as if words alone could glue the pieces of a shattered ceremony, I sat still. My body hurt from the fall, my shoulder pulsed in time with my heartbeat, but none of that pain compared to the weight inside my chest. Humiliation clung to me like smoke, but beneath it something deeper stirred, a memory old and sharp, cutting through the haze of the present. That's how it always is for me. When life presses hard, my mind runs backward, back to sawdust and motor oil, to the smell of pine and the sound of a little girl's laughter bouncing through a garage. Emily was 6 years old when I built her that chair. Not the kind of chair that folds or collapses under weight. Not a chair meant for decoration, but a small wooden seat carved out of pine with my own hands. She had been hanging around the garage every evening, her legs too short to reach the ground, her questions endless. What does this tool do? Dad, why does the engine make that sound? I didn't have much back then. Money was thin, grief was fresh, and life had me working more hours than there were in the day. But I wanted her to feel like she belonged in my world, so I made space for her. I took a few planks left over from fixing the porch, sanded the edges until my hands blistered, and hammered together a chair just her size. I painted it blue with the only paint I had. She sat in it every night after that, swinging her legs while I worked, handing me bolts she could barely lift, pretending she was helping. That little chair wasn't just wood and nails. It was belonging. It was love carved and painted in the middle of grease and grief. And when her mother died, that chair was where Emily sat, as we both cried, her tiny hand gripping mine, as if she could hold the world steady. Those memories came rushing back to me as I sat in the reception hall, the echo of marble still in my bones. Back then, I built a chair so my daughter would never feel excluded from my world. And here, decades later, her husband had yanked one away to humiliate me in front of everyone. The contrast burned under my skin. I forced myself to straighten my jacket as if dignity could be stitched back together with small motions. My hands shook slightly when I clasped them in my lap, but I made sure no one saw. The humiliation wasn't just about me. It was about Emily. She had to live with the fact that the man she loved, the man she had chosen, had made her father the butt of a cruel spectacle. I could see it in her face already, the way her bouquet slipped, petals scattering like broken glass across the aisle. Her lips trembled as if she wanted to say something but couldn't. I knew that war in her heart. She loved him, but love cannot erase shame. Ryan stood tall across the room, smugness dripping from the curl of his lips. He whispered to his friends at the table, venom spilling out in soft tones, the kind of cruelty that spreads best in quiet corners. But his arrogance couldn't hide the fact that his father, Colonel Samuel Hale, was staring at me as though he had seen a ghost. That whisper, "Sergeant Carter, is that you carried a weight far heavier than Ryan's taunts." I felt the shift in the room. Guests leaned forward, curiosity sparking like fire catching dry grass. The string quartet lowered their bows again, their eyes darting between me and the man in the doorway. Even the servers paused trays of champagne, hovering as the atmosphere thickened. I didn't answer him. I wasn't ready. That name Sergeant Carter wasn't one I had worn in years. It belonged to a younger man, one who had carried rifles instead of wrenches, one who had buried more than he cared to remember in desert sands far from home. It belonged to the soldier who had pulled men out of gunfire, who had done what needed to be done when the world was burning. I had packed that part of my life away when Maria died, when Emily was still small and needed a father more than the country needed a soldier. I had traded fatigues for overalls, rifles for socket wrenches, and I never looked back. Until now. But even without words, the recognition between me and Colonel Hale hung in the air. He stared at me like a man remembering a debt too heavy to be measured. My silence was deliberate. Let him carry it for a while. Let the room feel the gravity before I gave them truth. I leaned back in my chair, ignoring Ryan's smirk, ignoring the whispers that curled around me like smoke. Instead, I let myself drift again. Back to Maria. Back to the nights I came home from the garage, my hands black with oil, and she'd still smile at me like I was more than the tired man stumbling through the door. Back to the nights I held her when the sickness wore her down, whispering promises I couldn't keep. I'll protect Emily, always. That was the vow I made at her bedside when she took her last breath. Now, sitting in that hall, I felt the weight of that promise pressing harder than ever, because cruelty doesn't stop with a chair pulled out from under you. Cruelty tests boundaries. It grows if you let it. And Ryan's cruelty displayed so boldly in front of 100 witnesses was only the beginning. If I stayed silent forever, it would grow until it swallowed Emily whole. The officiant's voice stumbled forward, the ceremony dragging on as if nothing had happened. Vows were spoken, lips pressed together in a kiss, champagne glasses raised. But all of it was hollow. Guests clapped because they were supposed to not, because they felt joy. And every time I looked at Emily's face pale beneath her veil, I saw doubt creeping in, the first crack in the glass of the future she thought she was building. When the photographs began in the garden, when guests spilled outside to laugh nervously and pose as if nothing had shattered inside, I slipped away. Years of service and years of living in the shadows had taught me how to move quietly. I walked past roses heavy with blossoms, past the fountains of champagne, past the laughter that rang false. By the time I reached the street, the cool bite of late spring air hit my face like a second wake-up. My shoulder throbbed, my hand ached from catching the fall, but I flexed my fingers slowly. They were still mine, scarred, crooked from decades of work, but mine. These were the hands that had built my daughter's childhood bolt by bolt, paycheck by paycheck. These were the hands that had lifted engines and carried brothers through war. And these were the hands that would not let her life be consumed by a man who thought humiliation was power. I walked to my truck, parked a few blocks away, slid into the seat, and let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. Inside, the silence was different from the hall. It wasn't heavy with shame. It was the kind of silence that lets a man think. I rested my palms on the steering wheel, stared at the scars and calluses, and whispered to myself, barely audible, "This isn't over." And I knew it wasn't. The morning after the wedding, I woke before the sun. I didn't sleep much that night, not with the echoes of laughter still chasing me in the dark. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Ryan's smug grin and heard his words again. "Your place is on the floor." Those words clung to me like smoke burning long after the fire. I poured myself a cup of stale coffee, the kind that tastes more like habit than comfort, and sat at the kitchen table. Maria's picture was still on the mantel in the living room, her smile frozen in time, a reminder of promises I had made. I found myself staring at that photo for a long time, speaking silently to her, as if she were still in the room. I told her I was sorry that I had let her daughter's wedding turn into a stage for cruelty. That I had swallowed my anger instead of standing up in front of everyone. But then I reminded her of the vow I had made on the day Emily was born, and again on the day she left this world. I will protect our little girl, no matter the cost. And I knew then that the only place I could clear my head was the garage. The roll-up door groaned when I pulled it open, the metal, complaining like an old man rising from bed. Inside, the air smelled the same as it always had: motor oil, grease dust, and the faint bitterness of coffee that had sat too long on the hot plate. To most people, it would smell like labor. To me, it smelled like sanctuary. There, in the middle of the garage, stood my Harley, half-assembled chrome catching the weak light that filtered through grimy windows. I had been rebuilding that bike for years, never in a rush, always telling myself I'd finish it when the time felt right. Maybe I had been waiting for something like this, a storm in my life that demanded I remind myself who I was. I pulled on my overalls, the fabric stiff from years of wear, and went to work. The rhythm of it calmed me. Wrench tight, wipe down. Wrench tight, wipe down. My hands remembered the motions long before my mind did. That's the thing about honest work. It etches itself into your muscles. It doesn't matter how many years pass, the body remembers. At one point, I leaned back on the stool, wiped sweat from my forehead, and let my eyes wander across the garage walls. Photographs hung above the workbench, yellowing at the edges. Emily's kindergarten picture, her smile missing a tooth. Her first bike with the training wheels I had bolted on myself. High school graduation, her cap tilted, crooked, my arm wrapped tight around her shoulder. And then, one photo of Maria in her wedding dress, her eyes lit with a joy I could still feel decades later. I stared at Maria's photo the longest. I could almost hear her voice soft but firm. Don't let pride make you reckless, but don't let fear make you small either. Those words had guided me more than once. And now, I knew they would guide me again. The vibration of my phone cut through the silence. It was sitting on the workbench screen, glowing. I rarely used it beyond calls from Emily, but this wasn't from her. A notification. I tapped it open more out of habit than curiosity. And there it was. A photo of Ryan. He was grinning in a suit that probably cost more than my truck glass of champagne in hand, posted by one of his friends. The caption under it read, "She's perfect, sweet trusting." And her father, he's just a simple man. Just a simple man. I read it again slower this time, each word pressing harder into my chest. That's how he saw me. Not as the man who raised Emily alone. Not as the veteran who carried brothers through fire. Not as the mechanic who built an honest life bolt by bolt. To him, I was a punchline. Something to be tolerated, maybe pitied, but never respected. My first instinct was to crush the phone in my fist. My breath came shallow, my heart rattling like a loose bolt in an engine. But I forced myself to set it down carefully on the bench. My hands shook not with weakness, but with the weight of dignity pressed against rage. The old clock on the garage wall ticked loudly. Each second felt like a hammer against my skull. I leaned forward, elbows on my knees, hands clasped tight. I let the sting of those words settle, let them turn from anger into something sharper. Resolve. I turned my eyes back to Maria's photo. Her smile steadied me. I spoke softly, almost a whisper. I promised you, Maria. I promised I'd protect her. The promise didn't mean keeping Emily from making her own choices. She was a grown woman now, but it did mean she deserved the truth about the man she was about to marry. She deserved to know that the man who laughed at her father in front of everyone who called him simple behind his back would not suddenly turn into a man of honor once the rings were exchanged. I looked around the garage, tools neatly lined up, the Harley shining faintly in the half-light. This was the world I had built, not glamorous, not polished, but steady. And steadiness mattered. Stability mattered. Ryan didn't understand that. He thought power was about cutting others down, about controlling the room. He didn't know that real power was the quiet strength of holding a family together when life tried to tear it apart. I picked up a wrench again, tightened a bolt that didn't need tightening just to feel the weight of something solid in my hand. My reflection caught in the chrome of the bike gray hairline face eyes that had seen too much. A simple man maybe, but not small. The garage door rattled faintly as the wind pushed against it. Outside, the city moved on without me. Cars honked, neighbors shouted greetings across porches, kids laughed as they ran past. Inside, I sat in silence, the kind that fills you not with emptiness, but with preparation. Because I knew then that the battle ahead wasn't going to be fought with fists or shouts. It would be fought with patience, with truth, with the steady resolve of a man who has already survived worse. Ryan had shown me who he was, and now it was time for me to show him who I was. I stood, wiped the grease from my hands, and whispered once more to the photo on the wall, "Whatever comes, I'll keep my promise." It was 3 days after the wedding when Emily called. Her voice was brighter than usual, carrying that kind of rehearsed cheerfulness people use when they're trying to smooth something over. I knew that tone well. I had heard it in her teenage years when she tried to hide failing grades or when she came home late pretending everything was fine. Now that same tone carried over the phone. "Dad, she said Ryan wants to take us to dinner. Just the three of us. He thinks it would be good for you two to get to know each other better." I paused with the rag still in my hand, grease staining the lines of my palm. Dinner with him. The same man who had pulled a chair out from under me and called me simple behind my back. Every bone in my body resisted the idea. But when your daughter asks, you say yes. That's the burden and the blessing of being a father. So I told her I would come. That evening, I pulled my only suit from the closet. Navy blue, the one I had worn to Emily's college graduation and a dozen other milestones. The fabric was worn thin at the seams where I had stitched it myself, but it was clean and pressed. I tied my old silk tie, slightly frayed at the edges, and shined my shoes as best I could. I wasn't going to give him the satisfaction of seeing me look small. The restaurant was in Manhattan, one of those places where the walls are made of glass and the chandeliers drip light like golden rain. The Golden Fork, they called it. I'd seen places like that only in magazines left in barbershops. A doorman in white gloves opened the door as if I didn't belong there. Inside, everything gleamed polished wood crystal and conversations carried in hushed, careful tones. It smelled faintly of truffle and old money. Emily waved from a corner booth. She looked radiant, glowing in the dim light. My heart ached seeing her smile at me that way, hopeful as if this dinner could erase the ugliness of the wedding day. Beside her sat Ryan, his posture perfect, his suit cut sharp enough to slice air. He didn't stand until the last possible second, as though waiting was a form of power. When he extended his hand to me, it was limp and cold, held just long enough to avoid insult. "Mr. Carter," he said flatly. "Ryan," I nodded. Emily reached across the table to squeeze my hand. "Dad rebuilt his motorcycle from scratch," she said proudly, her voice carrying that kind of enthusiasm only a daughter could have for her father's work. Ryan's eyes flicked to me, then to his Rolex, as if calculating the worth of such an endeavor. Dangerous hobby for someone your age, wouldn't you say? I let the words pass. My silence wasn't weakness, it was discipline. The waiter approached with menus, but Ryan waved him off with a flick of his wrist. "Wine first." "The 2009 Bordeaux," he said, without asking if we wanted wine. His tone wasn't a suggestion, it was an order. The evening moved in rehearsed steps like a play he had performed many times. Polite small talk, at first Emily guiding the conversation, trying to bridge the gulf between us. She spoke about her design projects, her travels, the way she and Ryan were planning their honeymoon. I smiled when she looked at me, but my eyes kept drifting to him. His mask of charm was thin, stretched tight over arrogance. It didn't take long before the mask began to slip. He leaned back, finger-steepled eyes fixed on me as though studying a case file. "So, Mr. Carter," he said, "you work with your hands. That must be satisfying." "I'm a mechanic," I replied simply. "I fix things that are broken." "How refreshing." His smile was all teeth. "I'm in financial services, portfolio management, high-stakes investments. A different world, I suppose." "Different doesn't mean better," I said calmly. Emily laughed nervously, reaching again for my hand under the table, as if to remind me to stay patient. Her touch grounded me, but her eyes were pleading. When the food arrived, it was arranged like art on oversized plates, portions so small they looked more like decorations than meals. I cut into mine carefully, chewing slowly, more focused on the conversation than the taste. Ryan kept pressing. "Your daughter has told me about your neighborhood in Brooklyn. Very authentic, very working class. I imagine the sense of community must compensate for the limitations." I set my fork down slowly. "What limitations?" He smiled wider. "Oh, nothing specific. Just that once you experience certain standards, it becomes difficult to appreciate simpler pleasures. But that's generational, I suppose." Emily jumped in quickly, her voice light. "Dad appreciates nice things, too." "Of course he does." Ryan's words cut across hers. "Different perspectives, that's all." He turned back to me. "Tell me, Mr. Carter, what do you consider your greatest achievement?" The question was a trap. If I answered with pride, he would diminish it. If I answered humbly, he would interpret it as small ambition. I looked him straight in the eye. "Raising Emily." "Admirable," he said with a smirk. "Single parenthood must have been challenging. Limited resources, I imagine. No wonder Emily appreciates having someone who can provide properly for her future." Emily flushed red, her eyes flashing with anger. "Ryan, please!" "What I'm acknowledging your father's sacrifices. And now those days are over. She deserves the finer things." He leaned closer, his voice lower. "Don't you agree, Mr. Carter?" My jaw tightened. I gripped the napkin in my lap until the fabric nearly tore. Around us, glasses clinked, laughter rose from other tables, but in our corner, the air had grown heavy. "I believe in treating people with respect," I said finally, my voice steady. "Respect," he raised an eyebrow. I thought I was being quite respectful. "After all, I'm allowing you to maintain tradition. Some men in my position might insist on modern arrangements, but I understand the importance of letting older generations feel useful." Emily's glass trembled in her hand. "Please stop." The waiter returned just then, setting a black leather folder discreetly by Ryan's elbow. Ryan opened it with exaggerated surprise and then slid it across the table toward me. "Tradition," he said softly. "The bride's father pays." The number glared up at me, 347, more than a week's worth of groceries. Emily's face drained of color. "Ryan, that's not necessary." Nonsense. Your father wants to show his support. Don't you, Mr. Carter? The silence stretched thin as wire. My heart hammered, but my face stayed calm. Slowly, I reached for my wallet. The leather was worn smooth, a working man's wallet. My hands shook slightly, not from fear, but from the weight of dignity pressing down. I set my card on the table. "It's fine, Princess," I said softly. "Excellent." Ryan leaned back, triumphant. When the waiter returned with the receipt, I signed it carefully, each stroke a battle I refused to lose. The tip stung, but I gave it anyway, because dignity sometimes costs more than money. Ryan smiled as though he'd won something. "Thank you for dinner, Mr. Carter. I'm sure Emily appreciates seeing how well her two favorite men get along." The cruelty of it hidden behind politeness burned in my chest, but I swallowed it. Not here. Not now. I stood slowly, my chair scraping the marble. I placed my jacket over my arm, nodded once to my daughter, and walked toward the exit. Outside, the Manhattan night was sharp neon lights reflecting off wet pavement. I drew a long breath, the city's noise rushing over me. Taxis honked, people shouted, but all I could hear were Ryan's words. "Your place is on the floor. Your father pays." Simple man. I walked slowly down Fifth Avenue, each step carrying humiliation and resolve in equal measure, because I knew then beyond doubt that Ryan's arrogance wasn't just a flaw, it was a test. And men like him, when you let them win once, they never stop. It was just past 11 when the pounding started. Not a polite knock, a fist hammering on wood so hard the frame rattled. My house was quiet then. I had turned off the lamp in the living room, let the hum of the old refrigerator carry me toward sleep. But that pounding snapped me awake faster than any alarm. At first, I thought it might be trouble from the neighborhood. Brooklyn has its share of drunks and kids looking for mischief. But when I switched on the porch light, the figure standing there was neither. Ryan Hale. His hair was perfect even in the late hour, his expensive coat thrown open as if he'd come straight from a bar. But the look on his face wasn't polished charm. It was twisted raw, something uglier than what he wore at dinner. He looked like a man whose mask had slipped. I opened the door slowly, deliberately. He didn't wait for an invitation. He shoved past me, the scent of cologne and city smoke trailing behind. His shoes struck the hardwood like gunfire. He turned in the middle of my living room, eyes darting around, sneer, curling his lips as he took in the worn couch, the family photos on the wall, the mantel where Maria's picture sat in its frame. "We need to talk," he said, his voice sharp, louder than it needed to be. I closed the door quietly. "About what?" "Don't play dumb with me." His hands clenched at his sides. "Emily's been different since that dinner. She's asking questions. She's having doubts. I know you've been poisoning her against me." I leaned against the door frame, arms crossed, calm, steady, poisoning her or telling her the truth. He stopped pacing, his jaw tightening. "You told her I was disrespectful, that I don't value family, that I'm what some kind of monster." I didn't move, didn't raise my voice. I told her what I observed, nothing more, nothing less. His laugh was brittle forced. "Right. The concerned father act. Very touching." He stepped closer, trying to use his height like a weapon, but I'd seen real intimidation. This was theater. "Here's what you're going to do," he said, pointing a manicured finger at me. "Tomorrow you're going to call her. You're going to apologize. You'll tell her you were wrong about me, that you overreacted, and you'll stay out of our lives." I held his gaze calm. Or what? The question hung in the air. His face flushed red, the polish cracking. "Or you'll find out what it's like to lose her permanently." The words came out raw, desperate, louder than before. The silence that followed was heavier than the threat itself. I studied him, saw the twitch in his jaw, the sweat forming at his collar. This wasn't confidence. This was fear, wearing anger like a mask. This was a boy who had never been told no, now facing the possibility of rejection. "Young man," I said quietly, "I think you're forgetting yourself." "Am I?" He yanked his phone from his pocket, waving it like a weapon. "One call, one text. I tell her you threaten me, that you're jealous, that you're trying to break us apart. Who do you think she'll believe, her fiancé or her bitter old father?" I didn't move, but I shifted my stance just enough for him to feel it. That subtle steadiness of a man who'd carried heavier burdens than empty threats. Something in my stillness made him hesitate. For the first time since he barged in, uncertainty flickered in his eyes. He took half a step back. "You don't understand," he muttered, his voice rising again. "I've worked too hard to get here. I won't let some old mechanic ruin everything I've built." "And what exactly have you built?" I asked, my voice still low. Success, he snapped. Money. A future. He gestured around my modest living room as if it were evidence in a trial. Things you wouldn't understand. Real achievement. Not this. I looked around. The couch worn by years of stories. The dining table where Emily once spread her homework while I cooked spaghetti. The photo of Maria in her wedding dress, her smile still luminous. I looked back at him. This, I said, my voice steady, is a daughter who knows she's loved unconditionally. This is bedtime stories, scraped knees, piano recitals, and college tuition paid in overtime hours. This is what achievement looks like. Sentimental garbage, he spat, but his voice had lost its edge. The world doesn't run on bedtime stories. It runs on power money and knowing how to use both. Maybe your world does. I shifted slightly, not threatening, just enough to remind him whose house he stood in. But Emily comes from a different one. His collar clung damp to his neck now. Despite the cool air drifting through the open window, sweat shone at his temples. She'll choose me, he said, but the words trembled more plea than declaration. When it comes down to it, she'll choose the life I can give her. Will she? The question dropped between us like a stone in water. For a moment, I thought he might swing at me. His fist clenched, body taut, but something held him back. Maybe it was instinct. Maybe it was the way I stood still, but immovable. Maybe it was the faint echo of fear that he couldn't quite bury. This isn't over, he said finally, but the conviction had drained from his voice. Emily's mine. She chose me, not you. Emily isn't property, I said quietly. She doesn't belong to anyone. He turned sharply, stormed to the door, then stopped once more, his hand on the knob. You have no idea who you're dealing with. Actually, I said softly, I think I do. He slammed the door behind him. His car engine roared down the street tires, screeching as if anger could be measured in noise. The house fell silent again, the kind of silence that follows a storm. Only the clock ticked steadily on the mantel, the refrigerator humming its endless song. I walked to Maria's photo, lifted the chain around my neck, and pulled her ring into my palm. The gold was warm, steady against my skin. Maria, I whispered, I promised. I stood there for a long time, staring at her picture, the echo of Ryan's threat still rattling in the air. But underneath the anger, underneath the humiliation, something else settled. Certainty. The battle line had been drawn, and I knew then this was only the beginning. The morning after Ryan's pounding on my door, I sat on the porch with coffee cooling in my hands and watched the block wake up. A bakery truck hissed, the corner bus exhaled, and the world kept moving, while the echo of his threats still rattled my ribs. In daylight, big words shrink, but their residue clings. I flexed the hand that had steadied the door and felt the ache in the tendons. I thought of Maria's ring against my chest and of promises that do not depend on anyone else's behavior. By noon, I had wiped the bench, locked the garage, and driven into Manhattan. Emily's building rose like a glass rod, clean angles. The lobby smelled of stone and lemon polish. The elevator climbed without a sound. In the brass trim, I watched my reflection with each floor gray at the temples, a suit pressed more by care than by quality shoulders squared out of habit, not pride. I remembered why I came. Not to win an argument, not to prove a point. I had come to love clearly and stand still while she searched the truth. She opened the door before my knuckles touched it. She looked smaller than usual inside all that designer neatness. Hair pulled back too tight, a blouse chosen to look effortless, and failing at it. She stepped aside, and the apartment spread around us like a magazine page balanced color no clutter to catch the light. I sat at the edge of the sofa because sofas like that are made for looking more than resting. We took a slow lap around ordinary topics. I asked about work. She described a client who wanted a kitchen that pretended to be one. We let the sun move across the floor until silence set itself down between us. She started with a small story. At dinner with his colleagues, a woman mentioned her husband's layoffs. She noticed the thin smile that lifted one corner of Ryan's mouth as he called misfortune a symptom of weakness and spoke about momentum as if people were stocks. Then came other stories, each a pebble, none heavy, alone the way he sorts friends into columns, useful, impressive, forgettable, as if a life can be balanced. The apartment tours farther uptown where the river looked like an accessory, that once they married, there would be no reason to visit our block except holidays if schedules allowed. I listened and let the room hold her words. I nodded at pauses and breathed steadily when she ran out of air. When she faltered, I did the only thing that ever worked since training wheels and scraped knees and the night grief. Pulled up a chair at our table, I became still enough for her to lean against. She pressed her thumb into the center of her palm as if she could turn doubt into a single point and pin it there. Then the tears came, quiet tears that appear because the body cannot keep holding two truths at once. I told her very little. Confusion isn't failure. Love does not prevent seeing clearly. It just prefers to. Respect is the quiet bed where affection sleeps. Any feeling asking you to ignore your own reflection will wake you like an alarm. I spoke without hurry. She watched my face, measuring steadiness more than sentences. She's always trusted my weather more than my words. Maria's ring was warm through the cotton, a small clock that kept time with the only vow that matters. I let the quiet do the heaviest lifting. She admitted what I already knew. The reception had loosened a bolt inside her. She tried to tighten it with excuses, then planning, then silence. None held. She described the scrape of wood on marble, the way the room tilted, and how shame crossed her like a shadow she couldn't swear belonged to her. She said she feared asking him why, because answers are bridges, and sometimes bridges carry you somewhere you don't want to stand. His apologies arrived wrapped in confidence, bright words that looked like remorse from a distance and like polish up close. Outside, the city practiced its restlessness sirens, drawing lines through the afternoon horns, stitching impatience across the avenues, wind pushing rumors down the glass canyons. Inside, time did slower work. She rested her head against my shoulder, the way she had at 8 when the world felt too tall. I matched my breathing to hers until both settled. In that hush, I made the only promise that matters not with speeches, but with presence. You are not alone. The room softened by degrees. Even the shadow her doubts cast stopped looking like a threat and started looking like shape. When she lifted her head, there was more light in her eyes and more gravity in her jaw. She said she needed to think to look without flinching, to let the gloss of being adored wear off. She wanted to remember the sound of home, the kettle of the ball game on the radio, the wren clattering on the porch rail because memory is a compass. She smiled small and true when I offered coffee I did not have and laughed at herself for laughing. Something opened on its hinges. The click was almost audible. She walked me to the door and pressed my hand with both of hers. I stood at the window and tried to picture her life from that height. The city was beautiful and brittle. I thought of Maria and our promise to keep Emily safe, not with walls, but with a door she controls. The elevator sighed and carried me to the street. Doubt was planted as seed. Seeds want light and time. They do not shout. I drove home across the river and set the day on the bench like tools. Doubt, patience, love, truth. A storm was building. I didn't chase the wind. I checked the beams and waited for the sky to speak. Whispers travel faster than truth, sometimes faster than lies. They slip under doors, slide across diner counters, lean low in barber chairs. In a neighborhood like mine, whispers are currency. And lately, every one of them carried Ryan's name. The first came outside the hardware store. I had stopped for a box of nails, just another errand, when an old neighbor paused by the entrance. He shifted from foot to foot, his eyes flickering as if carrying something sour he didn't want to taste. Finally, he spoke. "Heard your daughter's fiancé was bragging downtown," he muttered. "Said once they're married, she won't have to come back to Brooklyn." Laughed like he was trading in an old car. I nodded, said nothing. Words like that don't need to be answered in the moment, but they followed me home, clung to me like dust on boots. The next came at the bakery 2 mornings later. Mrs. Rodriguez, who had handed me the same loaf of bread for 20 years, leaned across the counter, her hands trembling slightly. I overheard something she whispered. That young man of Emily's was at a cafe near her office. Said Brooklyn was a place you grow out of. Said it with a smirk. She slid the bread into the bag, eyes wet with apology, as if she wished she could take the words back. I thanked her, left a tip larger than usual, and carried the loaf home, heavy as a brick. Each whisper was a stone added to the pile. One alone meant little, but together they formed a wall, and behind that wall a picture of arrogance grew clearer. I tried not to let it consume me. I worked longer hours in the garage, tinkering with the Harley, even when there was nothing left to fix. Sometimes you just need the rhythm of work to keep your hands from curling into fists. I polished bolts already polished, adjusted parts already aligned. The garage filled with the smell of grease and the sound of clinking steel. honest noises unlike the sly whispers of men who measure respect in banknotes. But one evening, the whispers grew teeth. It was late. The sun had bled orange into the skyline, the streetlights flickering awake. I sat on the porch with a mug of coffee when Tom, my neighbor 2 doors down, walked over. Vietnam vet like me, though we rarely talked about it. He lowered himself into the chair beside mine, his joints stiff, his eyes heavy. He stared into his cup a long time before speaking. "People are talking, Gus," he said finally, "not in a good way." "What do you mean?" He shifted, uncomfortable. "Word is Ryan called Emily an acquisition, like she was something you buy, not someone you love." The word hit me like a round to the chest. Acquisition, cold, clinical. A business term, not a vow. My jaw clenched until my teeth ached. Tom glanced at me, guilt flickering in his eyes. "You didn't hear it from me," he added, then stood, leaving me with the word rattling around my porch like a stray bullet. That night, I sat at the kitchen table long after the clock struck midnight. The refrigerator hummed, the old house creaked, and outside the city carried on without me. I turned the word over in my mind again and again. Acquisition. Something you obtain. Something you own. Not someone's daughter. Not someone's heart. The next day confirmed it. I had driven into Manhattan to pick up a part for the Harley. Parking near the office towers is always a nightmare, so I idled at a curb waiting for a delivery truck to pull out. That's when I saw him. Ryan. Standing on the sidewalk, phone pressed to his ear, waving his free hand like the world was an inconvenience. I rolled the window down just enough to hear. I didn't mean to eavesdrop, but his voice carried sharp and confident. "No, trust me," he said. "She's perfect, sweet, trusting." And her father, just a simple man, exactly the kind who won't interfere. She's an acquisition. A step, that's all. My grip on the steering wheel tightened until my knuckles bleached white. The traffic light changed. A horn blared behind me, but I didn't move. I sat frozen, his words replaying in my skull, louder than the city around me. An acquisition. A step. He hung up, adjusted his cufflinks, and disappeared into a glass tower without ever noticing me. I finally pulled away the blur of taxis and pedestrians sliding past like ghosts. My heart pounded, my breath shallow. I drove straight back to the garage, the only place that still made sense. Inside, the Harley gleamed under the fluorescent light, half-assembled patient as always. I grabbed a wrench and tightened bolts that didn't need tightening just to hear the sound of metal yielding under my hands. Anything to keep from letting rage spill over. When I finally sat on the stool, my eyes drifted again to the photograph above the workbench. Maria. Her smile steadied her eyes, full of a love that had never treated me as simple. I whispered to her, picture voice raw. I promised I'd protect her. I won't let him buy her soul like stock. The clock on the wall ticked louder than usual, each second like a hammer against my chest. I realized then that Ryan's arrogance wasn't just cruelty, it was strategy. He wanted Emily because she was trusting, because she believed in people the way her mother used to. He wanted her because he thought she would never resist him, and he thought her father was too simple to stop it. He was wrong. Later that evening, I met an old friend at a bar 2 blocks away. Sam. We had served together 25 years ago. Now he was a lawyer, quiet, steady, the kind of man who carried calm into storms. He studied my face, saw the weight I carried without me speaking. "Talk," he said simply. So I did. I told him about the chair at the wedding, about the dinner in Manhattan, about Ryan pounding on my door, about the whispers, about that word acquisition. Sam listened without interrupting, nodding occasionally, storing details like a soldier, like a lawyer. When I finished, he exhaled slow. "You don't fight fire with fire, Gus. You let it burn itself out. Men like him, arrogance always eats them alive, but you don't meet it with silence either. You meet it with truth, with patience, and when the moment comes, you let the truth speak louder than any threat." I stared into my coffee, and if she doesn't see it until it's too late, then you catch her when she falls. His words settled heavy but steady. He leaned closer, his voice lower. "There's something else. I've heard his name before. Hale was tied up in a shady deal last year. Nearly cost the firm millions. They buried it, but people inside know. He leaves a trail, Gus. Men like him always do." I sat back, letting the information sink. A trail. Proof. Not just whispers, but evidence. For the first time in weeks, I felt something sharper than humiliation or rage. I felt strategy. When I left the bar, the rain had stopped. The streets glistened under the lamp's puddles, reflecting fragments of neon. I walked slowly back home, Sam's words echoing with each step. Patience, truth, strategy. In my garage, the Harley waited. I touched the handlebars and whispered, "We're not done fighting yet." The clock ticked steady, a countdown I could almost hear. The storm was gathering, and storms, once they gather, don't pass quietly. The night before a wedding is supposed to be restless for the bride, not the father. Yet I was the one pacing my living room, the old clock on the mantel ticking louder with every lap I made across the floor. The house smelled faintly of coffee that had gone cold hours ago. Outside, the city carried on sirens' horns, voices spilling from bars, but inside, time felt suspended. My daughter was set to marry in less than 24 hours, and all I could hear was that word Ryan had spoken with such confidence: acquisition. The phone buzzed on the table. Emily's name lit the screen. I answered before the first ring ended. "Dad," she said, her voice thin, breaking. "Can you come over?" I didn't hesitate. Kotke's door. The drive into Manhattan blurred past traffic lights, bridges, towers glowing like cold fire. When I stepped into her lobby, the doorman gave me a look I had never seen from him before. Sympathy. He called the elevator without being asked, murmuring to himself, "Third time this week." Emily opened the door before I knocked. Her eyes were red cheeks, streaked with tears, shoulders slumped as if carrying weight too heavy for her frame. She fell into my arms the second I crossed the threshold. I held her steady as I could, feeling the tremor in her shoulders. "What happened?" I asked gently when she finally pulled back. Her lips quivered. "I don't know if I can do this." We sat on the sofa, sleek, too stiff, the kind meant for display more than comfort. She twisted her engagement ring nervously, the diamond catching the light like a shard of ice. "Tonight we had dinner with his family," she whispered. "Ryan snapped at his cousin, called him weak for not making partner yet, said people who stay in middle-class neighborhoods are failures." She looked at me, her eyes wide, terrified. "Dad, he sounded like a stranger. Or maybe he sounded like who he's been all along," I said quietly. Her lip trembled. "What if you're right? What if I've been blind?" I took her hands in mine, my rough palms against her smooth skin. "Love isn't blind, Emily. Love chooses to see the best in people. That's not weakness. That's your strength. But respect is the ground love has to stand on. Without it, everything sinks." Her tears spilled over. She buried her face in her hands. I let her cry the same way I had let her cry after scraped knees and first heartbreaks. When she finally lifted her head again, her voice was barely a whisper. "I don't want to marry someone who makes me ashamed of who I am." Before I could answer, a knock came at the door. Not Ryan's angry pounding, a softer rhythm. Emily hesitated, then opened it. Standing there was Nancy Hale, Ryan's aunt. Older, refined eyes sharp enough to cut through pretense. She stepped inside slowly. "I hope I'm not intruding," she said. Emily wiped at her cheeks. "Aunt Nancy, what are you doing here?" "I needed to speak with you," Nancy said, settling into the chair across from us. "And with your father." Her gaze landed on me steady. "I've watched Ryan grow up. He's always been ambitious, but lately there's something darker in him. Something that worries me." Emily's breath caught. "Why didn't you say anything before?" "Because I wasn't sure. But tonight, hearing the way he spoke at dinner, I can't keep quiet anymore. He doesn't respect what he can't control." The words landed heavy in the room. Emily stared at her aunt, shock mixing with relief. "So it's not just me," she whispered. "No," Nancy said firmly. "It's not just you." Emily turned to me, then eyes searching mine for guidance. I spoke softly. "The choice is still yours, princess. Always yours. But at least now you see more clearly." She nodded, tears brimming again. Nancy reached across, squeezed her niece's hand. "Whatever happens tomorrow, know that you are loved." Silence settled. The city outside roared, but inside that apartment, the three of us sat with truth spread bare. For the first time, Emily wasn't alone in her doubts. She had me. And now, unexpectedly, someone from Ryan's own family. When Nancy left, she embraced me, gently whispering, "Protect her." "Always," I replied. Emily walked her to the door, then came back, and curled against me on the sofa, like she hadn't done since she was a child. Her voice was muffled against my shoulder. "Dad, what if I can't go through with it?" "Then you don't," I answered simply. She pulled back, eyes shimmering. "I'm scared." "Courage isn't the absence of fear," I told her. "It's doing what's right despite it." The clock struck midnight, its 12 chimes echoing through the apartment. Each note felt like a countdown, each strike a reminder that tomorrow the world would be watching. Emily lifted her head, fear and resolve mixed in her eyes. "Dad, stay with me tonight." So, I stayed. I sat beside her until sleep finally claimed her, her breathing steady, her face softened by dreams. I watched her, thought of Maria, thought of the promise I had made. Through the window, the skyline glittered, beautiful, brittle, indifferent. Inside, the only sound was the steady tick of the clock, carrying us closer to the day that would decide everything. And I knew then, whatever happened tomorrow, there would be no turning back. The morning of the wedding broke clear and sharp, the kind of April day when the sky looked scrubbed clean. I hadn't truly slept, just drifted in and out of restless thoughts, while Emily lay curled on the sofa, her chest rising and falling with the fragile rhythm of exhaustion. I stopped the clock on the mantel before I left her apartment at dawn. Its ticking had begun to feel like a hammer against my chest. At home, I dressed in the only suit I owned, the navy one patched and pressed so many times it had grown a second skin. I studied my reflection in the bathroom mirror, a man of 58 lines carved deep from years of weather grief and labor. Not elegant, not polished, but steady. And steady would have to be enough. By noon, I was standing outside Eternal Gardens, the venue Ryan's family had chosen. Everything about the place screamed perfection: white chairs in perfect rows, blossoms draped over arches, champagne flutes already sweating in silver trays. Guests floated in their finery laughter light and controlled like actors moving through a stage play. When Emily appeared at the head of the aisle, my breath caught. She wore Maria's dress, altered but still carrying the lace her mother had chosen decades earlier. For one moment, time folded. Past and present sewn together in silk and memory. When the officiant asked who gave this woman, I said I'd do my voice steady, though my chest ached as if something had been carved out. The vows were spoken, the kiss exchanged, and the applause rose like a cue from a script. Yet beneath the clapping, I felt the hollowness. The cracks that had already formed in Emily's dream still glistened beneath the paint. The reception hall was another cathedral of chandeliers and marble. Tables draped in linen white as snow silverware that caught the light like daggers. My place card was at table 12, far from the head table, tucked between distant relatives and one elderly aunt who barely remembered my name, a placement not by accident but by design. I sat quietly, eating, little nodding, when spoken to, the food tasteless in my mouth. The speeches began, glasses raised, stories told. I rose to join another table when a guest called me over to hear some half-forgotten anecdote about Emily as a child. I reached for my chair to slide it back under me, and suddenly it was gone. My knees buckled, my body pitched backward. For a moment, time slowed. Chandeliers above the clink of glasses cut short conversations, strangled mid-sentence. Then the crack of my body hitting polished floor, the sound ricocheting through the hall. Silence. Then laughter. Not everyone laughed, but enough. Sharp, unsure bursts that cut deeper than the marble beneath me. And above me stood Ryan, one hand still gripping the chair he had yanked away, his smile thin and sharp. "Oops," he said, his voice pitched too loud to be mistaken. "Looks like someone's a bit unsteady on his feet. Age catches us all." A few nervous chuckles answered him. Others gasped. Emily's cry pierced through the room, sharp and panicked. Ryan leaned closer, his words low enough for me, loud enough for others nearby. "Maybe you're more comfortable closer to the ground. Your place is on the floor." Those words stabbed deeper than the fall. Around us, chairs scraped, guests shifting uncomfortably. The photographer lowered his camera, uncertain if this belonged in the album or in the shadows. I stayed down longer than I needed to. Not because I was hurt, but because silence has weight, and I wanted them all to feel it. Let them see what humiliation looked like when cruelty dressed itself as humor. When I rose, it was slow, deliberate. Emily reached me, first bouquet, abandoned her hands frantic on my arm. "Dad," she whispered, panic in her eyes. "I'm fine, princess," I said softly. My voice was calm, but inside fire crawled beneath my skin. Her eyes darted to Ryan, her face pale with fury and shame. She looked at him as though she was seeing him for the first time. And then boots. The sound cut across the marble, steady, deliberate, military. Not polished shoes, not rehearsed steps. Boots that carried history. At the entrance stood a man in his 60s, silver, streaking his temple shoulders squared despite the years. His tie was slightly askew, his breath faintly labored from haste, but his presence filled the room. His eyes swept the scene, me rising from the floor. Ryan standing smug, Emily trembling, and then locked on me. He stopped dead, his color drained, his lips parted. "Sergeant Carter, is that you?" The words barely above a whisper silenced the room more completely than a shout. Gasps rippled across tables. The string quartet froze, bows hovering midair. Heads turned from him to me, from me to Ryan. Emily's hand tightened around mine, her knuckles white. Ryan's face drained of smugness, confusion, flickering, then dawning horror. The man stepped forward, voice louder now, trembling with reverence. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his hand pointing toward me. "This man, Daniel Carter, saved my life." The hall stilled. Even the chandeliers seemed quiet. "In Iraq, 2003, he continued, voice breaking. When I was trapped under fire, bleeding, ready to be left for dead, he carried me on his shoulders through 300 yards of bullets and smoke. Without him, I wouldn't be here. Without him, there would be no family for me. No son. Nothing." A murmur spread, different from before, not cruel, reverent. Ryan staggered back, his chair clattering behind him. He opened his mouth, but no words came. Emily's eyes filled with tears, pride and grief warring in her expression. She looked at me, as if seeing me anew, her father not humiliated, but revealed. And me, I stood steady, silent, letting the truth carry the weight Ryan's cruelty never could. For years, he had called me a simple man. For months, he had tested, humiliated, and tried to reduce me. But in that chandelier-lit hall, with the weight of memory pouring from his father's mouth, I was more than simple. I was a soldier, a father, a survivor. And suddenly, every eye in the room was not on Ryan, but on me. Silence held the hall like glass. Colonel Samuel Hale stood inches from me, breath steadying as the story of a night in Iraq finished crossing the room. Gratitude altered his posture. Shame altered his son's. He needed no microphone. His voice carried on weight alone. He faced the guests, then his son, then me. Order mattered, truth before discipline, discipline before apology. He spoke my name plain, wrapped in the rank I once wore, and thanked me as soldiers do, simple, exact, eyes steady. Emily's fingers pressed into my palm. The tremble there was not fear anymore, but recognition sliding into place. Humiliation had painted me small. Gratitude redrew me at my right height. I kept still. Stillness protects dignity better than speeches. He addressed Ryan without volume and cut clean. He named the chair, the laughter the sentence meant to pin me to the floor. He said cruelty is cowardice in polish, that honor doesn't perform, it behaves. He named the debt he owed a life carried out of fire, and the debt his son owed to decency. Ryan's face retreated from itself. His hands found no place to rest. Whispers shifted from gossip to him. Men adjusted ties as if they had clapped for the wrong thing. Women who had laughed smoothed napkins, ironing nothing. Instruments rested like gentle scoldings. I lifted my chair and set it where it belonged. The scrape drew more notice than it deserved. I sat. Emily did not let go. Her shoulders squared. Her eyes, still wet, had cleared. The colonel crossed the last feet and spoke quietly for nearby tables. He apologized for arriving late, for a son he did not recognize, for a blindness other people's praise had manufactured. He did not beg forgiveness. He promised correction. I nodded. Some resolutions need only two people who mean what they say. A steward fidgeted with a microphone. The officiant clutched his script near the cake. There was no script left. I rose because silence wanted direction, and because my daughter deserved a father who could stand in a room built to belittle him and be larger than the ceiling. I kept my words brief. Respect is not a chair you pull away. It is a chair you hold. Marriage is not a stage for cleverness. It is a workshop where humility keeps the tools clean. Love survives many things, but it cannot breathe where contempt eats the air. I was not persuading. I was describing the ground we should walk. Emily touched the chain beneath my shirt where Maria's ring lay warm. Then she turned to the head table, lifted her left hand, and slid the ring free. The diamond suddenly unlit, looked more like a shard than a promise. No one clapped. Reverence replaced noise. Ryan's mouth opened and closed, discovering words can't lift fallen things. He reached out not to hold her, but to retrieve an object. She set it on the table between crystal flutes. The tiny metal-on-wood sound traveled. She returned to me. Her fingers found mine again. A woman at a far table stood. Then others not in celebration, but in acknowledgement, the way people rise in court when truth enters or leaves the room. The colonel rose, last head bowed, as if before a flag folded too many times. We walked out together. Not quickly, not triumphant. As people stepping back into alignment, the hallway smelled of wax and flowers. Outside, April air felt rinsed, the city refreshed by its ordinary noises. Emily breathed in the night and released it like saved relief. On the steps, the colonel caught up and placed a hand on my shoulder, the precise weight a soldier recognizes. He offered spare words for Emily about pride repair and family not being a corporate structure. For Ryan, he said there would be reckonings and work. For me, gratitude that would not expire. He returned to face what was his. We did not drive far. My block looked as always porch lights, dogs, the burr of a late game on a radio lives paying bills in ordinary currency. We sat on the stoop coffee cups without coffee elbows, on knees, seeing more by looking at less. Emily leaned into my shoulder and watched the block edit the day into memory. We spoke in low tones about small things, the blue chair from when she was 6, the missing screw that rolled beneath the bench, the pie Mrs. Rodriguez sometimes left because goodness multiplies when passed along. The large thing did not need naming. It had already arranged itself. She asked whether I was angry. I told her anger is smoke after a fire. It clears if you don't feed it. I said I was grateful for the timing of boots on marble, for truth's odd appointments, for the thin thread that leads people out of rooms where they don't belong. She rested her head and nodded the way children nod when the world has been too loud, and someone finally turns the volume down. I went inside, fetched Maria's photo, and brought it back to the steps. We didn't say a prayer. We didn't have to. Presence is its own liturgy. The ring on my chain touched the frame with a sound so soft I might have imagined it. I told Maria silently that the promise had been kept in the manner promises should be kept, quietly and completely. When the hour asked us to choose sleep, we stood. Inside the house received us with its familiar shoulder creak and refrigerator hymn. I set the photograph on the mantle. The clock resumed ticking, not as countdown, but as permission. And if you stayed with me through this, thank you. If it reminded you that dignity can rise from a hard floor, stay with us. Subscribe, say where you're listening from, and pass this to the one person who needs a quiet kind of courage tonight. The next story waits. The light will be on.